Is anybody else keeping up with all the third-party stuff for the Switch 2? So first things first, let's start with Famitsu sales numbers, which obviously most of you know by now are the weekly Japanese sales numbers that track hardware and software sales. As a quick recap, they completely overtracked what was sold for the Switch 2 in the first month, leading to many people and many articles being released saying that the Switch 2 was the fastest selling console in Japan in its first month. But after Nintendo released their first quarterly numbers, it turned out that the Switch 2 was actually not the fastest selling console in Japan. Obviously, the headlines are not going to correct that, but somebody should say something. Now, after that whole situation happened, there was like a lot of drama around Famitsu. People were wondering what they were going to do. And it turned out they adjusted their numbers by subtracting what was released on launch weekend. I'll be honest, after all of that happened, I didn't really feel confident in covering Famitsu numbers anymore. I don't want to spend too much talking about what the Japanese sales numbers were, only to have people debate something and discuss something and make conclusions, and then Nintendo pops up in November and be like, here's our next quarterly report, and it turns out Famitsu is completely off again. It's a waste of everybody's time. But based off of forums like VG Charts and Installbase, where people are pretty level-headed when it comes to these estimates, supposedly this is the largest blunder that Famitsu has had in something like 20 years. So I don't know if I can completely discount what they're doing and assume that it's not going to be accurate going forward. At the very least, I think it's worth covering the data. We're not in a launch month anymore, so like those minor 10% differences won't make a huge difference, or at least I hope not. But my confidence levels in anything from Famitsu is going to be cemented once we see how close they are when the Nintendo quarterly reports come out. Until then, we'll take it with a grain of salt. In any case, so 2 weeks ago, I decided to not make a video about the sales numbers. I just made a post instead. It was the worst performing week since the Switch 2 launched. Like, to give you an idea of how well it performed, it was just about on par with how well the Nintendo Switch 1 did last year. So it's like impressive for a console in its 7th year, but not really impressive for a console in its first year. Now, it's been 2 weeks since we got those numbers because it was a holiday in Japan, so last week's numbers were delayed to this week. And this week shows that there were just under 180,000 sold over a span of 2 weeks, which means you have a 2-week average of 90,000 a week, which is a good uptick for the Nintendo Switch 2, but it's still ultimately the 3rd and 4th worst performing weeks since the console launched. And really, if you take out the anomaly that was the week prior to the launch of Donkey Kong Bonanza, where the sales were lower because stock was being withheld so that in the following week when Bonanza came out, they can pump out more numbers, the lines show a pretty steady decline with a couple of dips along the way. Now, mind you, these are still not doom and gloom numbers. And that's partially because there is still demand in Japan, but there's also a lot more supply than when the Switch 1 released, for example. In these same weeks of August during the Switch 1's launch, it was behind the Switch 2 by about 300,000 or 400,000. But if you look at how the following weeks went, the numbers are really all over the place. And even if you look at the weeks prior to that, it's the same thing. You got like over 100,000 and then below 30,000. This variance shows just how hard it was to keep proper stock during the Switch 1's lifetime. But with the Switch 2, since it's launched, it's been a comfortable drive downwards. It indicates that there's dwindling interest more than it indicates that there's unpredictable constrained stock. Now, does that mean that the Switch 2 is completely readily available everywhere you want to go in Japan like it is here in the United States? No, but it is still fairly available. That being said, it's very hard for me to actually gauge it because I am not a native Japanese speaker. But I've been making attempts to kind of dig around different websites and follow different forums in Japan just to kind of get a feel for what the people are saying over there. At first, I was just kind of digging around for like a single search. And then I don't know, it felt like walking into a whole different world. I was very intrigued by it, and I've now noticed myself searching a few different websites pretty consistently. I think I got sick of Reddit, so this was a lot more entertaining. Anyway, so something that gets repeated fairly often by a lot of people in Japan is that if you go to a big box store on the weekends, you'll be able to grab one pretty easily. And a lot of times you'll find people taking jabs at others saying stuff like, well, it's because you're lazy and you only want to do it through the lottery online, that's why you don't have one. So it's like one of those things where if you make a little bit of effort, you'll get one, but if you expect it to just come to you pretty easily, you're not going to. At first, in June and through the first parts of July, people were saying that they had to go very early, line up in front of the stores, generally on weekends, and within minutes the consoles would get sold out. Actually, wait, let me correct that. In the first couple of weeks, it was just lotteries. By the time they got to like the 3rd week, that's when they started doing the lineups on the weekends. And then when you fast forward to July, people were saying you don't have to get there that early. If you come a little bit later in the day, they usually still have stock available. And then it was like you have to get certain memberships, like a credit card for the store in order to get it. So the retailers were obviously finding a way to capitalize off of the Switch 2. It reminds me of like when bundles were being sold for $900 from GameStop if you wanted to get a PS5, for example. And then like now it's gotten to the point where they say as of August 18th, so that was this past weekend, nobody was lining up anymore, and if you walked into the store, you can just grab a Switch. So they've been selling out, but they're selling out at a slower rate. And keep something in mind, stock is not only limited by Nintendo. Like, I feel like people just assume that Best Buy, for example, gets 10 Switch 2 units shipped to the store that's down the street from your house, and that's when you can buy it. And those 10 units are sent directly from Nintendo. But the way it works is that Nintendo sets it to retailers, and then retailers decide how many units to sell on any given day. And they want to keep the demand up because they get to make extra money off of it because people are coming into their store. Especially in these stores that are requiring you to sign up for a credit card or a membership or whatever. So for them, it's more beneficial to spread out the amount of units they're selling. They also want the high demand. They also want to have enough stock so that people are always coming back for more, but not too much stock where people will come in on one day, buy it, and leave. And this is relevant because the idea that the Switch 2 sales are going downwards in Japan is a supply constraint issue, in part is true. That's not technically incorrect. But when the numbers consistently trend downwards, it's partially because the retailers see fewer and fewer people coming every week and they want to maintain stock going into the following week. Again, if you compare it to the Switch 1 numbers where they were just flying up high and down low, that was like when something was produced, it was sent out to the store and hoping that people could buy it right away. In this case, the trends are a lot more manufactured. At least, honestly, this is what it seems like to me. Bringing back some of the forums that I've been lurking in, specifically Install Base and VG Charts, I'll see many users making the same comments that I'm making, and then they usually very quickly get shunned and insulted. And in this case, I saw somebody get banned today because they thought that Kirby was not a smart system seller. They were being told that they were derailing the conversation, but that's a separate discussion. The point is, I'm not the only person pulling this out of thin air. There are a lot of people who are saying that it looks like it's dwindling interest. And I mean, you can kind of see it. By the end of June, it was just under 1.3 million, with almost 2/3 of that being done on the first weekend alone. And as of today's numbers, we're at like 1.857 million. There's a very likely scenario here where after the first month was done, over the course of the following 2 months, they still didn't manage to double the numbers that they did in the first month. In contrast to the original Switch, where the numbers of the opening weekend were just about doubled by the end of the first month. And this is to be expected. It's what a top-heavy launch looks like, and in my opinion, it's just gonna slowly dwindle downwards. The September Direct cannot come soon enough, in my opinion. Now look, if you don't trust me because I'm not like an expert on Japanese stock and inventory, obviously, I don't even know how much I trust myself when it comes to the Japan demand. I'm aware that I'm basing a lot of what's going on over there strictly on my experiences here in the West. But not for nothing, I am the only person probably in the entire world that was screaming in June that the Switch 2 would realistically be readily available within a month. I was the only one yelling in a void saying that you'll be able to buy a Switch 2 very comfortably by the end of July. And now we are 1 month removed and the Switch 2 has been in stock and hasn't sold out. And whatever people want to say about that is their choice. Whether they want to claim it's because Nintendo had enough stock available, whether you want to be a doomer and say that there's no demand for the Switch 2, whether you want to put scalpers into the discussion, whatever the case is, that's irrelevant. And look, I'm not saying this to toot my own horn. I'm saying this because many people, including me, thought I was crazy at the end of June and early July when I was saying that the Switch 2 will be readily available soon. And if my hunch was right back then, I feel pretty confident about my hunch for Japan as well. It seems like a similar pattern over there where the demand for the Switch 2 is not nearly as high as people thought it was going to be. And that's not to say there's no demand. Just like there was still demand in the United States, it just was not nearly as high as everybody was trying to make it out to be prior to the Switch 2's launch. And obviously there are a plethora of reasons for this, the biggest one being the price. People were being sold on this idea that it's going to be a very expensive and worthwhile Nintendo console that's going to be getting all of the best third-party support. And again, I'm not saying this because I want to tell you I told you so, but I did mention over and over again that the Switch 2 is being sold as a lie. I said in the beginning that we're being told the Switch 2 costs this much, we're being told Mario Kart World costs this much because Nintendo wants you to pay for it, not because it's worth that amount. And the counter argument for many people was that we were paying for the better performance and the price matches the quality. And it's been a very consistent 3 months of people realizing that this is just a Switch 1 all over again when it comes to the weaker performances and when it comes to the crummy third-party support. You guys saw everything that's being shown on Gamescom. Daemon X Machina, terrible. Elden Ring Switch 2, disaster. Madden, awful. Early reports of people that got early access to FIFA were saying the same thing too. WWE 2K crashes randomly while people are playing it. That was a game that was highly praised. Of course, you got Call of Duty, which is not even going to be making it onto the console. Everybody yet again went into another month where they assumed that Microsoft was going to be bringing Halo onto the Switch 2. The same type of rumors that were around when they were talking about bringing it onto the Switch 1, and again, it's not coming. And then throughout all of this, you have Cyberpunk 2077, the darling of the Switch 2. You know, there's a little tangent here, but a few weeks ago, I saw a whole crap ton of posts of people saying, look at my haul for the Switch 2. And this is obviously mostly on Reddit, where I'm convinced that marketers are taking over most of the posts. And it would be somebody taking a picture of their Switch 2 with just third-party games next to it on a Nintendo subreddit. I don't know, dude, that's a little sus to me, especially considering that almost all of the Switch 2 sales up to this point have been first-party titles. But yeah, those posts were coming up quite a bit while Madden was on the homepage of Nintendo.com, and it was also right after Nintendo sent out their surveys. I think there was just a big marketing push to get third-party developers to have more representation on the Switch 2, and I don't think it's working. Anyway, let's put the conspiracy theory tangents to the side for a second. Cyberpunk, the darling of the Switch 2, because it's a game that apparently is a miracle that it's even running on this hardware. And it's also praised even more because it was actually on a cartridge and not a game keycard like all of the other third-party titles. Digital Foundry did a benchmark test to see just how strong the Switch 2 actually is. And in their own words, the Switch 2's power actually falls somewhere between the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 4 Pro. It seems like it's being throttled by its CPU. You guys can watch that video on your own, it's on their DF Clips page. But just like the dwindling sales patterns of the Nintendo Switch 2, there's also a dwindling drop in what they're comparing it to as far as how powerful it is. So we started in the very beginning with probably as strong as a PlayStation 5, right? Because when it was announced, the PlayStation 5 was 5 years old. So everybody's like, oh, the Switch 2 is going to be a handheld PS5. That's phenomenal. Eventually, we conceded that it would only be a Series S. And we're like, okay, you know, that makes sense. It's still a modern day console. It's not a PS5, but it's still good. And then it was like between a Series S and a PS4 Pro. That didn't last long. It almost immediately dropped down to a PS4 Pro. And everybody was like, well, I don't care if it's a 9-year-old console. This is a handheld device. What, PlayStation 4 Pro on the go? Are you kidding me? This is a miracle from Furukawa. And now it looks like we aren't even at PS4 Pro levels. So now this very strong, brand new Nintendo console that we're paying so much more for because of how powerful it is just slightly better than a console that was released in 2013. But hey, at least some people play it in handheld, so yippee. And like, this wouldn't be so bad if we didn't wait so long for the Switch 2 to come out. Like, it's been a 12-year gap since the PlayStation 4, and we're comparing it to that. If it came out back in like 2021 or 2022, like everybody had wanted the Switch Pro to launch, it definitely would have been a lot more respectable. But the Switch 2 is getting aged out almost immediately, and it's already being highlighted, but it's going to get even more highlighted over the course of the next couple of years. Now, also, to go full circle and go back to the Famitsu sales, with this brand new console that everybody wants to get their hands on, and the third-party support needs to come clamoring and jumping over each other so they can support it and get the sales numbers, there isn't a single Nintendo Switch 2 title in the top 10. There are plenty of Switch 1 titles. I mean, they're mostly Switch 1 titles, actually, so Nintendo wins regardless, but it's part of the reason why this is much more reflective of a Pro console than anything else. And mind you, this is not an anomaly. The last time a third-party Switch 2 title was in the top 10 for these Japanese sales numbers was the number 8 Tamagotchi Plaza by Bandai Namco, which released on July 10th, and it just barely sold over 4,000 units. Meanwhile, the Switch 2 version of Super Mario Party Jamboree managed 19,000 units over the span of the past 2 weeks, so even if you divide that by 2, it's still double what the last third-party Switch 2 title to make the top 10 was. And this is Super Mario Party Jamboree, the Nintendo Switch 2 edition. A horrible Switch 2 edition. But at the end of the day, like we've all been saying, Nintendo is only a first-party device. That's the only reason people buy it. Everything else is just a little side that you sometimes grab when you're at a restaurant, but for the most part, you only want the burger and that'll fill you up. Actually, Nintendo games are like the burgers and the fries and the ketchup. The third parties are like the mozzarella sticks where it's like, if I'm really hungry, maybe I'll buy it this one time. Anyway, speaking of which, it's almost lunchtime. I'm gonna take the kiddos and go to a diner. Go eat some first-party Nintendo titles. Definitely not getting the third-party ones, though. We don't need any mozzarella sticks today. But yeah, that's all I got. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch y'all on the next one.